In the 12th and 13th centuries, the rulers associated with Galloway, Fergus, followed by Uchtred, Roland, and Alan, held power in a way that reflected the complex politics of the British Isles. Fergus himself had been placed in authority under unusual circumstances, and the position he and his descendants held depended partly on their relationship with the English crown. By recognising English claims and authority in certain situations, they secured acknowledgement from England as the governors or lords of Galloway. This arrangement strengthened their influence in Scotland at a time when Scottish kings were often politically weak and heavily influenced by foreign nobles. Fergus and his descendants controlled the lordship of Galloway from about 1139 until 1234. Many historians have suggested that this ruling line represented an external element within the region, rather than a continuation of the older Celtic leadership that had once dominated the area. Their presence had long-lasting consequences for the district. During their rule, increasing numbers of foreign settlers arrived, many connected to Norman and feudal networks that were spreading across Scotland during the reigns of reforming kings. Over time, this influx transformed Galloway into a contested frontier, where rival families and factions struggled for land and influence. The native Celtic population, known for its strong warrior traditions, found itself at a disadvantage in this new political landscape. The newcomers were supported by powerful institutions, especially the Roman Church, and by the legal framework of feudal charters that defined ownership and authority. Many of the older Celtic landholders did not initially recognise the importance of written charters, sometimes dismissing them as little more than pieces of parchment. Unfortunately for them, those documents carried enormous legal weight in the evolving feudal system, and over time they reshaped the entire structure of land ownership in the region. Another striking feature of the ruling family of Galloway is how brief their line actually was. From Fergus to the last of his descendants, only 4 generations held the lordship, covering roughly 95 years. That short span is remarkable when compared with the lifetimes of many individuals in the region who lived just as long or longer. In addition, while Fergus himself bore a Gaelic name, the names of his successors reflected different cultural influences. Uchtred and Gilbert were names of Anglo-Saxon origin, while Roland and Alan were associated with Norman traditions. The presence of these names has often been cited as evidence that the ruling family was deeply connected to the broader Anglo-Norman world that dominated political life across Britain during this period. The fact that Fergus had a Gaelic name does not necessarily prove that he was ethnically Gaelic. In earlier centuries, the peoples of the British Isles, Scots, Norse settlers, and others interacted extensively, and personal names often crossed cultural boundaries. The name Fergus itself even appears in Scandinavian contexts. After the death of Alan, the last of the main rulers of this line, the lands and influence of the family became divided among heirs through marriage alliances. One of the most significant figures connected to this transition was Roger de Quincey, who married Alan's eldest daughter Eleanor. Through this marriage, he inherited important authority, including the prestigious office of Constable of Scotland. Roger's father, Robert de Quincey, had earlier established his position in Scotland during the reign of Scottish kings who welcomed many foreign nobles into their service. The Quincey family had originally followed the Norman conquerors who reshaped England after the 11th century. One of their relatives even became Earl of Winchester under King John. Seeking opportunity beyond England, Robert de Quincey eventually settled in Scotland, particularly in the region of Fife. When Roger later assumed control of lands in Galloway through his marriage, tensions in the district rose again. A rebellion broke out in 1247, illustrating how unstable the political situation remained. Roger de Quincey died in 1264, leaving 3 daughters whose marriages further redistributed influence in the region. Among them, the wife of Alexander Comyn, Earl of Buchan, remained especially prominent in connection with Galloway. Meanwhile, de Vorgilla, another daughter of Alan from a later marriage, inherited additional lands after the death of her sister Christian, who left no heirs. By the end of the 13th century, the political map of Galloway had become fragmented. When the struggle for the Scottish crown began in 1291, after the extinction of the direct royal line, half of the lordship of Galloway belonged to John Balliol. He was the son of de Vorgilla, and later became one of the main claimants to the Scottish throne. The other half of the lordship was shared by the husbands of the daughters of Roger de Quincey and Elena. These included William de Ferrers, Alan de la Zouche, and Alexander Comyn, Earl of Buchan. Together they controlled not only the title of lordship, but also large areas of land across the district. Later, writers sometimes claimed that the rulers of Galloway possessed the surname MacDowell. However, surviving medieval charters tell a different story. In documents where these individuals appear as witnesses to royal grants, they are consistently identified by personal names and family connections rather than by a fixed surname. For example, Fergus appears simply as Fergus of Galloway, while Uchtred is described as the son of Fergus. Roland appears as the son of Uchtred, and so on. This pattern reflects the naming practices of the period, when hereditary surnames had not yet become firmly established in Scotland. Even the famous family of the Scottish Stewards did not adopt a permanent surname until later, when the title of their office eventually evolved into the name Stuart. Charters from the reign of King David of Scotland provide valuable insight into how these figures were regarded in their own time. In such documents, witnesses were often listed in an order that reflected their rank and importance. Royal family members and leading church officials usually appeared first, followed by earls and high officers of state, then by lesser nobles and other witnesses. In several charters, Fergus and members of his family appear after the higher-ranking nobles and officials, suggesting that their position was not among the highest levels of the aristocracy. This supports the interpretation that they served primarily as regional governors, rather than independent princes. Many historians have therefore concluded that the rulers of Galloway were administrators appointed or supported by powerful kings, rather than hereditary monarchs of an independent kingdom. Their authority developed through the cooperation of royal courts and the church, which played a central role in confirming and recording land grants. Some scholars have suggested that the family may have had Norse roots or connections to the broader Anglo-Norman world, which would help explain their rise within the political system of medieval Scotland. As the 13th century came to an end, events across Scotland pushed Galloway into an even more turbulent era. The death of King Alexander III in 1286 and the subsequent loss of his direct heirs created a crisis over the succession to the Scottish throne. Rival claimants emerged, and political factions formed throughout the kingdom. Galloway, already divided by competing landowners and loyalties, became one of the regions most affected by the instability. Warfare and shifting alliances disrupted everyday life and slowed the development of stable government in the district. During these years, the English King Edward I carefully expanded his influence over Scotland. He presented himself as an arbitrator in the dispute over the Scottish crown. But his actions increasingly revealed broader ambitions. Castles in Galloway and neighbouring areas came under English control, and royal officials from England began administering the region. Some local nobles supported these arrangements, while others resisted them. Despite the confusion and conflict of the time, a powerful movement for Scottish independence gradually emerged. One of its most famous leaders was William Wallace, who rallied resistance against English domination in the late 13th century. His campaign inspired many across the country, although support varied from region to region. In Galloway, loyalties were divided and not all landholders joined the struggle. Still, Wallace's efforts helped keep alive the idea that Scotland should remain an independent kingdom. The later rise of Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland would eventually change the course of the conflict. But Bruce's path to power unfolded only after years of resistance, sacrifice, and political upheaval. The earlier struggles led by figures such as Wallace played a crucial role in maintaining the spirit of independence that allowed Scotland to survive as a separate realm. Robert Bruce's claim to the Scottish throne was never the strongest in strict legal terms. It stood at a greater genealogical distance than that of John Balliol, whose right, according to the accepted rules of inheritance, was stronger. Balliol, however, was deeply entangled with England. Although he became King of Scotland, his rise depended heavily on the backing of Edward of England, and that support came at a humiliating price. Bruce's path was different. His bid for the crown gained real force only after the killing of John Comyn, an act that pushed him into open rebellion and made retreat impossible. From that point onward, he was forced into a struggle that demanded the same kind of resolve and military endurance that had already been shown by William Wallace. Balliol's reign quickly revealed how weak his position truly was. He gained the crown only after recognising Edward as Scotland's superior lord, and once crowned, he was required again and again to perform acts of submission. Within a matter of days, he was made to swear loyalty and repeat his homage. The humiliation did not end there. During the following year, he was summoned several times to appear before Edward in the English Parliament, a clear sign that his kingship was being treated as subordinate. Only after repeated insults and constant pressure did Balliol finally attempt to resist English domination. By then, the damage had already been done. His authority had been hollowed out, and he appeared less like an independent king than a ruler trapped inside another monarch's system of control. Bruce might easily have failed in the same way, or even ended in a worse position, had circumstances not shifted in his favour. One of the greatest turning points came when Edward tried to interfere in church patronage within Scotland. That decision proved politically explosive. The Scottish Church had often cooperated with interests tied to Anglo-Norman power, but it was unwilling to accept direct domination in matters it regarded as its own. This transformed the situation. Bruce, who had been condemned by the Church after the killing of Comyn at Dumfries, was gradually restored to favour. That reversal mattered enormously. Once the Church moved behind him, men of influence who had previously stayed cautious or neutral began to join his cause. In time, Bruce's kingship was supported by bishops, abbots, priors, and a smaller circle of powerful allies who gave his rebellion legitimacy, resources, and structure. The scale of that support was decisive. Bruce was not carried to power by battlefield success alone. He rose because leading churchmen and political backers turned his cause into one that could survive. Without them, even his coronation would have been in doubt. Financial support also played its part, because the struggle required money as much as swords. In this sense, Bruce's rise differed sharply from the path taken by Wallace. Both men were formidable fighters, and both became central figures in the resistance to English power, but their motives and positions were not the same. Wallace fought without the promise of a crown. Bruce fought for kingship as well as independence. Wallace stood as a defender of the country itself, while Bruce combined national resistance with dynastic ambition. That contrast shaped how later generations remembered them. Bruce became king and entered the centre of official Scottish history. Wallace, by contrast, remained something larger than office or title. He represented defiance without personal gain. He had no throne to win and no royal inheritance to secure. His struggle was driven by loyalty to Scotland rather than by a claim to rule it. That distinction gave him a unique place in memory. Bruce was a great military leader and eventually a successful king. But Wallace was the figure who carried the idea of resistance through its darkest stage. Some later writers tried to reduce Wallace's standing by describing his family as dependents of the Stewards. That interpretation oversimplifies a much more complicated reality. The Stewards themselves do not emerge clearly in Scottish history until the 12th century. Their early story begins with Walter, who entered the household of King David I in a minor role and rose through royal service. His family background was far from grand. His grandfather, Flard, is often connected to the Norman world that expanded after the conquest of England. But the evidence does not place him among the great land-holding elite. Neither Flard nor his son Alan held major English estates during the earliest phase after the Norman conquest. Their rise came later through opportunity, service, and careful advancement. Walter's progress under King David was steady and significant. He appears to have begun in a relatively humble household capacity, and then advanced to become steward, a title that gradually expanded in importance. At first, the role was tied closely to the management of the royal household, but in time it came to involve broader authority, including control over revenue and administrative influence. Once that level of office was reached, the family's future was secured. Lands were granted in different parts of Scotland, and through these grants the stewards became major territorial magnates. One of the regions tied to them was part of Kyle, which later became known as Kyle Stewart. It was there that the Wallaces were originally established. This created a feudal relationship in which the Wallaces could be described as vassals of the Stewards. But that language must be understood carefully. It reflected the legal structure of landholding, not necessarily differences of origin, antiquity, or inherited dignity. The Wallaces were not made lesser in historical standing, simply because a rising officeholder gained superiority over the district, through royal grants. In fact, the stewards owed much of their power to that very system of chartered advancement, a process that repeatedly elevated newcomers over older local lines. The feudal order changed status on paper, often very quickly, and did not always reflect older realities on the ground. Romantic treatment of the Stuart family has often obscured the harsher side of their history. Their later prestige encouraged writers to view them through a flattering lens, while the damage done by some of their actions in Scotland received less attention. In the story of Wallace, this matters greatly because the man widely remembered as the betrayer of Wallace came from that same Steward connection. John of Rusky, tied to the Steward line through his father, became associated with the capture that ended Wallace's campaign. His family had already strengthened its position through disputed inheritances and aggressive acquisition of lands. In one such case, rights attached to the Earldom of Menteith were effectively taken aside in favour of Steward interests. The result was another example of how influence and force could outweigh fairness. John's betrayal of Wallace left a deep stain. For that service, he was rewarded by Edward of England with valuable lands alongside other privileges. The act became infamous, and the name attached to it carried a lasting burden in Scottish memory. Yet confusion later arose because titles and surnames were used in ways that blurred the true identity of the men involved. The hatred attached to the deed was often transferred broadly, while the exact family and political context became harder to see. Even so, the underlying fact remained clear enough. Wallace was not defeated in fair combat at the height of his power, but trapped through treachery. Another subject that produced intense debate was the question of whether Wallace left descendants. Some later writers dismissed the old tradition that he had married and left a daughter. Yet that tradition survived for centuries and was not treated casually by earlier generations. According to long-standing accounts, Wallace's wife was Marian Braidfute of Lamington, and their union produced a daughter. That daughter was later said to have married into another family line, linking Wallace's blood to later landed houses. The surviving literary tradition around this story is not neat. Different versions vary and details are not always consistent. But inconsistency alone does not erase a deeply rooted tradition, especially in a period where evidence for marriages, births, and inheritance often disappeared or was never formally recorded in the first place. This is one of the great difficulties in medieval Scottish history. So much material was lost, destroyed, altered, or never written in a form that survived. After the religious upheavals of later centuries, many local records vanished. Registers that might once have confirmed marriages, baptisms, or lines of descent were destroyed or scattered. In other cases, charters were shaped by self-interest, and legal documentation reflected political needs, rather than perfect truth. It is therefore dangerous to dismiss long-standing traditions simply because the surviving record is incomplete. Many noble and landholding families would fail strict modern standards of proof if judged only by what still survives in writing. The claim that the Baileys of Lamington descended from Wallace through a daughter remained important for a long time, and it was not a modern invention. Families connected with Lamington continue to preserve that belief. Later inheritance patterns, especially through heiresses, carried the estate into other families, but the older tradition was not forgotten. Even when the direct male line failed, the sense of descent was maintained through marriage and inheritance. Another branch, associated with Dunragit in Galloway, was also linked to this wider line. That branch continued in the male line longer than the Lamington house itself, and its later history became entangled with legal struggle, local power, and eventual decline. The story of Dunragit ended in hardship. A young laird lost his estate during his minority under circumstances that later generations regarded with suspicion. Powerful neighbours and legal pressure appear to have closed around him at a moment when he was too vulnerable to resist. He attempted to recover his position, travelling more than once in pursuit of justice, but failed. During one of these journeys, disaster struck when important papers were lost in a river crossing. The loss broke his remaining hopes, and he died soon afterward. With him ended the male line of that branch. The representation then passed through the female side, tying the memory of Wallace's supposed descendants to yet another family transition. All of this explains why the question of Wallace's daughter mattered so much. It was not merely a genealogical curiosity. It touched inheritance, local identity, and the continuity of families that believed themselves connected to Scotland's greatest patriot. To dismiss the entire tradition as invention ignores how historical memory actually worked in medieval and early modern Scotland. Oral history, family preservation, local reputation, and scattered written testimony often operated together. They did not always produce perfect certainty, but they cannot be treated as worthless. The old narrative tradition around Wallace has often been criticised for inconsistency, especially the work associated with Blind Harry. Some of that criticism is justified, because the story is not arranged with the discipline of a modern historian. Events do not always follow a clear order, and episodes sometimes sit awkwardly beside one another. Yet, It would be a mistake to treat that as proof of total unreliability. Much in the traditional account reflects local knowledge, remembered places, and genuine admiration rooted in long-standing memory. The survival of so much detail through oral transmission is itself remarkable. A blind minstrel, working centuries after Wallace, still carried forward a body of tradition that preserved names, locations, and heroic episodes that later generations continue to recognise. That deserves respect rather than easy dismissal. Blind Harry was not simply an entertainer repeating empty legend. Payments made to him at court show that he was regarded with distinction. He was more than an ordinary performer. His work helped shape Wallace's image for centuries, and although it cannot be accepted without caution, it cannot be discarded as fantasy either. Oral tradition, especially when tied to a national hero, often preserves truths in ways that formal records do not. It may alter sequence, heighten drama, or blur detail, but it can still carry the core of remembered history. The same can be said for the men who fought beside Wallace. Too often, later accounts focus on names that became prominent afterward, while giving too little space to the companions who shared the struggle itself. Some of the bravest figures in Wallace's circle remained in the background, even though their deeds were central to the resistance. Men such as Stephen of Ireland and Macarel of Cruggleton belong to that harder story of action, loyalty, and sacrifice. Their names are tied to dangerous operations, including the retaking of strongholds under extreme conditions. These were not ornamental followers gathered later by tradition. They were part of the small, determined core that kept resistance alive when almost everything favoured England. This matters because the independence of Scotland was not secured in a single moment by one famous king. It survived because Wallace and a handful of close companions refused to let the cause die. They preserved the idea of resistance at a time when many of the powerful either submitted, hesitated, or calculated their advantage. Bruce later transformed that struggle into royal victory, but the path had been kept open for him by others who fought first and died sooner. The rewards of kingship, land, and title came later, mostly to those who stood with Bruce at the end. Wallace and many of his closest allies did not live to share in those rewards. In that sense, the memory of Wallace stands apart. He was not merely one warrior among many in the Wars of Succession. He became the moral centre of the struggle because he fought when victory seemed least likely, and gain was least possible. Bruce eventually took the crown and redistributed lands and honours to supporters. Wallace never reached that stage. He gave his cause everything and received no kingdom in return. That is why his place in Scottish history remained so powerful, even when later politics, dynastic pride, or family ambition tried to reshape the narrative around more convenient figures. By the year 1300, Edward I turned his attention directly toward Galloway. He overran the eastern part of the region and sent forces across the Cree into the west, aiming both to intimidate and to calm the inhabitants. The policy mixed pressure with calculated restraint. The goal was not simply destruction, but control. Whether it won genuine loyalty is harder to judge. In any case, the district remained unstable, and old rivalries soon sharpened again. Among the most important opponents of Bruce in the southwest were the MacDowells, a family connected with the descendants of Somerled and long hostile to Bruce's interest. Their resistance became highly significant in 1306 and 1307. When Thomas and Alexander Bruce arrived near Loch Ryan with several hundred men drawn from Ireland and Kintyre, they were attacked by forces led by Dungal MacDowell. The encounter ended disastrously for the Bruces. Thomas and Alexander were captured after a fierce struggle, along with Reginald Crawford, and all were sent to Carlisle, where execution quickly followed. MacDowell also sent grisly trophies taken from other slain opponents, a gesture meant to display loyalty to Edward and prove the completeness of the victory. For this service, he received knighthood from the English king. Edward's death in July 1307 changed the political climate at once. For Scotland, it removed the greatest single source of relentless military pressure. Bruce moved quickly. In the autumn of that year, he entered Galloway seeking revenge for the loss of his brothers and demanding local support. Lands belonging to the MacDowells and to other opponents were ravaged. At that stage, the district was still under English-aligned administration, and substantial forces were sent to check Bruce's advance, forcing him north for a time. But the struggle was not over. The following year brought a sharp reversal. Edward Bruce returned to Galloway and defeated the MacDowells and others who opposed him. The fighting was severe, and contemporary descriptions suggest heavy slaughter. English cavalry forces operating in the area were caught by surprise and badly beaten near the Cree. That victory shifted the balance. English control in the district weakened, and Galloway was gradually brought under Bruce authority. Lands forfeited by Balliol, the Comine interest, and other absentee claimants were redistributed. Edward Bruce received both the lordship of Galloway and the Earldom of Carrick, placing enormous territorial power in his hands across the southwest. As Lord, Edward Bruce strengthened his position not only through force but through grants and confirmations. Religious houses had to be accommodated, their privileges confirmed, and in some cases expanded. The church remained a power that no ruler could ignore. At the same time, old tensions continued beneath the surface. Negotiators sent by England failed to draw the Galwegians back into their former allegiance, though some local figures still accepted English protection when it suited their interests. The region was not uniformly loyal to either side. It remained a contested landscape where survival, memory, family rivalry, and shifting political fortune often mattered as much as ideology. In 1315, Edward Bruce crossed to Ireland with a large army, hoping to strike at English power there and perhaps create a second kingdom under Bruce control. His brother later reinforced the campaign. Edward was crowned king in Ireland, but the venture never achieved the stable support it needed. Years of campaigning followed, marked by hard fighting and limited consolidation. Finally, in 1318, Edward Bruce was killed at the battle near Dundalk. His death ended one of the boldest but most difficult phases of the wider Bruce strategy. He left no legitimate heir, though he did leave a natural son, Alexander, who later received the lordship of Galloway under a grant limited to male heirs. That line did not endure long. Alexander was later killed in battle, and his only surviving child, a daughter, carried forward inheritance elsewhere. After the death of Robert Bruce in 1330, the political temperature in Galloway did not cool. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, moved through the region soon afterward and held a justice court at Wigtown, a clear sign that the Crown still saw Galloway as a district requiring close supervision. Order there was never simple. Old loyalties, old resentments, and the memory of recent war still shaped local life. Only 2 years later, in 1332, Randolph and Archibald Douglas returned in a far harsher mood. Their campaign brought devastation to the district in retaliation for the part local forces had played in helping disrupt Scottish plans against Perth. Galloway remained a region where national struggles were felt at ground level, in burned lands, broken alliances, and renewed punishment. The minority of David II soon reopened wider conflict across Scotland. Edward III of England revived the struggle for the Scottish crown by backing Edward Balliol, son of the former King John Balliol. That decision pulled Galloway back into the centre of war. The district was especially vulnerable because so many of its leading families had ties that stretched across competing worlds. Some were linked to the Balliol interest, some had long-standing connections with English power, and others, including families like the McDowells, occupied an uncertain space between local ambition and larger political allegiance. The result was exactly what might be expected in such a frontier society. A substantial body of landholders and fighting men in Galloway could not always be trusted to act with one mind for the Scottish crown. That instability became even more visible after the Scottish defeat at Neville's Cross in 1346, where King David II was taken prisoner. Among the captured was Sir Malcolm Fleming, Earl of Wigtown, though he later escaped. Members of the MacDowell family were also taken, and their release came under conditions that exposed the shifting loyalties of the time. Hostages were given, and service against the Scots was expected in return. Their temporary association with King David proved short-lived. The English victory gave fresh confidence to Edward Balliol, who tried to strengthen his influence in the southwest by establishing himself at Whittle Castle. It was a calculated move. Galloway still contained families willing to work with England for pay, protection, or advantage, and Balliol hoped to build on that. Among those who supported his efforts were the MacDowells and the McCullochs, along with other local men who received wages or pensions from the English crown. Yet, Balliol's attempt to root himself in Galloway never truly succeeded. Even when negotiations were underway for the release of David II, Balliol's representatives tried to secure recognition of his rights from the English king and council. Assurances were given, but the effort changed little. By 1353, Sir William Douglas of Douglas entered Galloway with armed force and brought the district back under obedience to the Scottish cause. One of the most important local leaders forced to submit was Duncan MacDowell. In Cumnock Church, before the Regent Stewart, he formally renounced his allegiance to the King of England. This time his submission held, and he remained faithful to that vow. The deeper problem, however, did not vanish. The mixture of bloodlines, landed interests, and outside influence that had entered Galloway generations earlier continued to shape its troubles. Much of this had developed through the policies of David I and through the early lords who had tied the region more closely to feudal and foreign systems of power. The later Balliol Rising brought hardship to many who had supported it, but most of its followers eventually adjusted to the triumph of the Bruce line and saved themselves through submission. Families such as the MacDowells and the McCullochs survived repeated reversals with remarkable flexibility. Part of that endurance came from local resilience, but part of it also came from the steady support they could draw from England. In effect, many of them lived for long periods as men whose fortunes depended on both sides of the border. Even after the worst of these political storms had passed, Galloway did not become a peaceful land. The Earldom of Wigtown itself became another example of how unstable authority remained. Malcolm Fleming, the first Earl, was followed by his grandson Thomas, since his own son had died earlier. But Thomas eventually gave up the earldom to Archibald Douglas in exchange for a large payment. The reason was not simple poverty or convenience. He was driven to the sale by what were described as severe feuds with the most powerful native elements in the earldom. That detail matters. It suggests that local hostility to imposed authority had not disappeared. The old population may have changed over the centuries, and no pure remnant of the earliest inhabitants likely survived as a separate people. Yet the district still retained a deep resistance to outside domination, especially when that domination came wrapped in titles, charters, and legal superiority. The transfer of the earldom to Archibald Douglas showed how Galloway was treated by the political class of medieval Scotland. Land, lordship, and superiority could be moved like property in a transaction. Royal confirmation made these arrangements fully legal, but legality did not guarantee acceptance on the ground. To the people of the district, the Flemings and the Douglases were still outsiders, who had acquired authority through the machinery of the state rather than through old local consent. This helps explain the fierce reputation the men of Galloway acquired in later literature. Their resistance was not simply wildness. It was also the reaction of a society repeatedly managed, transferred and overruled by powers that viewed the land as a prize. Archibald Douglas never used the title Earl of Wigtown in the way later tradition might suggest. After his rise in rank, he was known instead as Earl of Douglas and Lord of Galloway. His rule, and that of his descendants, lasted from the late 14th century into the middle of the 15th. Though not especially long in historical terms, it was long enough to leave a strong mark on the district. Their domination was often harsh. Galloway during these decades lived under a powerful magnate house whose interests were broader than the region itself. Then, in 1455, the tide turned. James, Earl of Douglas, was condemned, his lands were forfeited, and the king moved decisively against him. Thrieve Castle fell after a short siege, and the lordship of Galloway, including the Earldom of Wigtown, was annexed to the crown. That was not the end of royal redistribution. Later, the lordship of Galloway, together with Thrieve Castle and the customs of the burghs of Kirkcudbright and Wigtown, became part of the marriage arrangements of Margaret of Denmark when she married James III in 1469. Once again, the region was handled as a valuable political possession. During the years after the death of James III, government in the southwest remained significant enough that the Earl of Bothwell was appointed governor of the Stewartry of Kirkcudbright and the Shire of Wigtown until James IV reached full age. Galloway still mattered strategically, and its fighting men were still known for their toughness. At Souchiburn in 1488, Galwegians appeared among the forces that helped shape the outcome of the battle. Their reputation as hard men of war survived long after the Great Succession struggles had passed. Certain local families continued to hold influence at court and in regional politics. Alexander MacCulloch of Myrtoon, for example, enjoyed royal favour and served as master of the king's hawks, receiving a notable pension. In the troubled years that followed, especially during the minority of Mary, Queen of Scots, Galloway also showed moments of striking loyalty to the crown. Yet even then, the older pattern remained visible. Ambitious families still watched for opportunities to strengthen their claims, particularly in moments of religious and political change. Around the time of the Reformation, the Flemings again tried to secure advantage in Galloway. Court favour, family connections, and church office still mattered, and a single charter could reveal how deeply intertwined lay power and ecclesiastical privilege remained. But political history is only one side of Galloway's past. Religion had an equally powerful hold on the district, and its roots reached back far before medieval kings and earls. Long before Christianity, the landscape itself preserved signs of older belief. Stone circles, cairns, rocking stones, and ancient ritual sites pointed to a sacred world that once commanded deep reverence. Among the Celtic peoples, the Druids had held immense authority. They were not simply ritual figures. They taught, judged, preserved learning, and stood close to the centre of power. Among some Celtic communities, they acted almost as philosopher priests. In other traditions, the word could also carry the sense of magician or seer. Their influence was profound, and their spiritual system included belief in the immortality of the soul. Tradition holds that their influence did not vanish all at once. Even when Christianity was spreading, memories survived of Druids retreating to places on the edge of the known world after their old authority collapsed. By the late Roman age, however, a new religious chapter had clearly begun. One of the most important figures in that transition was Ninian, associated with Whitthorne and remembered as an early preacher of Christianity in the region that once formed the Roman province of Valentia. His mission was directed not merely at a single settlement, but at a wider population stretching across what later became southern Scotland and northern England. Ninian is usually seen as a man of British stock, part of the old Cymric-speaking population, and as someone who had travelled far enough to absorb Christian influences shaped by the Roman world. Patrick, whose name later became inseparable from the conversion of Ireland, is also generally linked to that same broader British background. Accounts of his life differ in chronology and detail, as happens so often with early saints, but the larger point is clear. Christianity in these Western lands did not arrive in a neat or simple way. It spread through movement, contact, local missions, and the travel of churchmen between Britain, Gaul, Italy, and Ireland. It was not a sudden event, nor was it created in perfect form from the beginning. Sacred objects found in places already associated with worship suggest that Christian practice had sometimes preceded the arrival of the best-known missionaries. By the time Patrick's mission gained momentum, the island he entered was not a religious blank slate. The same complexity surrounds Columba, later one of the most powerful names in the religious history of Scotland. His move from Ireland to the island of Iona in the 6th century became one of the defining moments in the spread of the Irish monastic church into northern Britain. Columba was not an obscure figure wandering into exile without background. He belonged to a high and powerful line, and his origins were tied to the dynastic politics of Ireland as much as to the religious life of the church. That political side of his story cannot be ignored. He lived in a world where churchmen and ruling families were often deeply entangled, and his own career reflected both religious energy and political involvement. Once established at Iona, however, the impact of his foundation became extraordinary. From that island monastery, missionaries, scholars, and clerics moved outward across a wide landscape. Their influence touched the Picts, the Scots of Dalriada, and the peoples of places like Galloway. The community at Iona was monastic in structure, but its mission was larger than cloistered devotion. It taught, copied, preached, and organised ecclesiastical life over a broad region. The abbot held exceptional authority, and even bishops could exist within a system where the monastery, rather than the diocesan pattern, stood at the centre. This was one of the distinctive features of the Irish and Columban church. That church also maintained customs that differed from Roman practice in important ways. The dating of Easter was one of the most famous points of disagreement. There were also differences in discipline and church organisation, yet this should not be romanticised into a vision of a completely separate or pure primitive church, untouched by wider Christian tradition. The older church of Iona was not a modern reform movement centuries before its time. It was monastic, ritualised, and ascetic. It possessed strong local character and resisted papal control, but it was still fully part of the wider Christian world of its age. Simplicity in the later Protestant sense was not its defining feature. Iona's connection with Galloway remained strong for a long time. That was no accident. The Irish background of Columba and the strong Irish Gaelic element in Galloway made the relationship natural. Monks from Iona and its dependent communities worked in the region, and the monastery itself eventually came to hold lands there. Though the original buildings were destroyed more than once by Norse attacks, the institution endured in memory and influence. Many records must have been lost in those raids, and the destruction of books and archives was one of the greatest wounds inflicted on early Scottish history. Much that would now illuminate the early church in the southwest simply vanished in fire and plunder. The older ecclesiastical order, however, did not survive unchanged into the age of kings like David I. Long before David, the process of change had already begun. Queen Margaret, wife of Malcolm III, played a crucial role in reshaping the religious life of Scotland. She is often praised for piety, discipline, and devotion, and those qualities were real enough. But she was also a figure of strong will who pressed for conformity with the customs of the Roman Church as practiced in England and on the continent. Her interventions were not minor. Through discussions with Gaelic clergy and through the authority that came from both crown and court, she advanced reform in ways that weakened the older Celtic ecclesiastical traditions. Those encounters have often been presented as theological victories achieved through argument and holiness. But power was never absent from them. Margaret had the force of monarchy behind her. Her husband Malcolm could bridge linguistic and cultural gaps, and the pressure placed upon older church traditions was immense. The issue of Lent and the date of Easter may have stood at the surface, but something larger was underway. The religious world tied to Iona and Gaelic-speaking clergy was losing ground to a model more closely aligned with Roman and Anglo-Saxon practice. What happened in eastern Scotland under Margaret was extended and completed more forcefully under her son David. David I transformed the church in Scotland in ways that reached far beyond doctrine. He reorganised institutions, encouraged new monastic foundations, supported continental and English religious orders, and tied ecclesiastical change to broader political change. In Galloway and elsewhere, this meant the displacement of older patterns by imported ones. The clergy associated with the older Irish and Gaelic tradition had once lived in linguistic and cultural harmony with much of the population. That mattered. They belonged to the same world as the people among whom they worked. David's reforms gradually replaced that bond with something different, an ecclesiastical structure that suited his larger political project of reshaping the kingdom through feudal organisation and through the settlement of Anglo-Norman and other foreign elites. This was one of the most consequential shifts in Scottish history. The church was not changed in isolation. Religious reform marched alongside colonisation, land grants, charter law, and the redistribution of power. New abbeys, new orders, and new bishops were part of the same process that brought foreign knights, administrators, and legal customs into old Celtic districts. Galloway felt that transformation deeply. The religious houses connected to the newer order gained authority, property, and influence. The older Columban world, already weakened, could not compete. Its books disappeared, its voice faded, and its institutions were absorbed, replaced, or forgotten. Even the story of the British Church before these reforms remains clouded by uncertainty. Claims that Christianity reached Britain directly through one of the apostles, or through figures like Joseph of Arimathea, belong more to legend than to secure history. The spread of the faith in Roman Britain was likely slower and more ordinary. Soldiers, traders, officials, and settlers probably carried Christian ideas into the province in fragments before organised churches grew. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian communities certainly existed, though their exact shape remains difficult to reconstruct. Persecution, distance, and isolation must all have affected their development. What later missionaries encountered was not a vacuum but a religious landscape already marked by centuries of change. By the time saints like Ninian, Patrick, and Columba entered the story, Christianity in Britain and Ireland had already passed through many hands and many forms. It was missionary, monastic, sometimes learned, sometimes politically entangled, often regionally distinctive, and never entirely uniform. Galloway stood within that wider world, shaped first by native sacred traditions, then by the British mission field, then by Irish and Columban influence, and finally by the Romanising reforms of the medieval Scottish monarchy. Each stage left a mark. Each stage also displaced something older. When the religious community of Iona lost its influence, its monks also lost the lands they had once held across Galloway. Their long connection with the region ended abruptly. Many returned to Ireland, while others remained and adapted to the new religious order that was spreading across Scotland. Today, it is impossible to trace every estate that once belonged to the Iona community, yet scattered evidence survives. Almost every parish in Galloway preserves some memory of the church's former authority, reminding us how deeply religion shaped the life of the district. A similar transformation soon took place in Ireland. During the mid-12th century, church leaders there formally accepted the authority of the Pope. This shift was closely connected to the arrival of Anglo-Norman power. Within a generation, England extended its control over Ireland, a conquest that began in the 12th century and permanently altered the political and religious landscape of the island. From the reign of King David I and the rule of Fergus, the first Lord of Galloway, the region became heavily influenced by the clergy. Earlier times had known smaller Celtic religious foundations. Among the most notable was the church dedicated to St. Martin at Whithorn, along with a number of modest chapels scattered across the countryside. One of these, at Cruggleton, still survives in ruined form. But the arrival of the Norman branch of the Roman Church brought dramatic change. Monasteries, abbeys, priories, parish churches and chapels appeared across the landscape. Within a few generations, religious buildings dotted the entire district. The church did far more than guide spiritual life. Clergy became some of the most skilled farmers of their age, introducing improved agricultural methods. Many were also active in trade and local commerce. In certain cases, churchmen even commanded military forces, showing how closely religion, politics, and power could be connected during the medieval period. Learning was concentrated in religious institutions. Most clergy could read and write, a rare ability in an age when education was limited. Latin was widely understood among them, allowing communication across Europe. Monasteries became centres not only of prayer but also of craftsmanship and technical knowledge. Skilled artisans, scribes, and builders often worked under the protection of the church. Because the clergy were believed to hold authority over the spiritual fate of every person, their influence reached deeply into society. Even powerful nobles feared the disapproval of church authorities. This power helped the church acquire enormous wealth. Before the Reformation, nearly 1/3 of Scotland's land belonged to religious institutions, and much of it was the most productive soil. In many cases, titles and privileges were granted by church authorities, long before the Crown issued similar honours. This fact shows how powerful ecclesiastical institutions had become. Landowners sometimes placed their estates under the protection of the church to avoid feudal duties or political conflicts. Some believed this would secure their family inheritance, yet such arrangements could be dangerous. Once land came under church protection, it was often difficult for families to regain control. Documents preserved from the period show that written charters were not always reliable. In some cases, new charters were created to replace earlier agreements that had been made through symbolic gifts rather than written contracts. In other situations, documents may have been produced to justify claims that were never truly granted. The church possessed skilled scribes and legal experts who understood how to shape documents in ways that strengthened ecclesiastical control. Stories from medieval archives even describe methods used to attach genuine seals to newly written documents. A seal taken from an authentic charter could be carefully separated and transferred to another document. Once attached with fresh wax and carefully smoothed, it could make a forged grant appear entirely legitimate. Historians have long warned that even genuine charters cannot always be trusted. Powerful families often maintained their own clerks whose duty was to produce records that supported their master's claims. These documents acted like legal fortresses, protecting authority and privilege. Church institutions were particularly skilled in maintaining such records. Their archives became some of the most complete collections of medieval documents. The Reformation eventually brought an end to the dominance of the Roman Church in Scotland. Yet this transformation created another problem. Monasteries had served as the main repositories of charters, family records, and local histories. When these institutions collapsed, vast quantities of historical material disappeared. Some records were carried abroad, but many others were simply destroyed. Old manuscripts were sometimes treated as worthless paper. Accounts survive describing merchants who bought entire library collections for a few coins and used the pages as wrapping material for goods. Such losses created enormous gaps in the historical record. Galloway suffered particularly from this destruction. During the medieval period, the region contained several abbeys and priories that kept detailed records of land ownership and local events. When these collections vanished, much of the early history of the district was lost with them. The ruined condition of many abbeys and religious houses has often been blamed entirely on the religious reformers. In reality, the story is more complex. Some damage occurred during military campaigns, especially during the time of Cromwell. Yet much of the destruction resulted simply from neglect. Once the buildings lost their religious purpose, they were gradually dismantled for building materials. Stones from monasteries were reused in houses, farm buildings, village walls, and other structures. In many cases, decorative carvings and inscriptions disappeared into later constructions. This practice continued for centuries, meaning that fragments of medieval religious buildings may still lie hidden within later structures across the countryside. After the fall of the old church, another wave of land seizures began. Powerful courtiers and royal favourites moved quickly to acquire former ecclesiastical lands. Under the authority of the crown, they claimed estates that had once belonged to monasteries and priories. Investigations were often little more than formalities, and decisions frequently favoured those with influence at court. Administrators who had managed church estates during the transition were careful to protect their own interests. With many earlier records already missing, it became difficult to challenge their claims. In many cases, estates changed hands under circumstances that remain highly questionable. The disappearance of additional charter books added further confusion. Dozens of volumes covering many years simply vanished. Some may have been lost at sea when records were transported by ship, but others may have disappeared under less innocent circumstances. Despite these controversies, the Reformation itself transformed Scotland in lasting ways. Many people believed it brought a new clarity to religious life and removed the overwhelming authority once held by ecclesiastical institutions. One of the central figures in this movement was John Knox. Through family connections, he later became linked with Galloway as well. Knox faced enormous challenges while establishing the new religious structure in Scotland. At first, there were too few trained ministers to serve the population. Temporary measures were introduced. Educated laymen were appointed to read prayers and scripture until better trained clergy could be prepared. These readers were encouraged to guide congregations in worship and gradually develop greater knowledge. Knox also rejected the idea of imposing a rigid liturgy. Instead, ministers were given freedom to adapt prayers and sermons to the needs of their congregations. the goal was to build a church guided by scripture rather than elaborate ceremony. Debates about church authority soon followed. Some argued for a hierarchy of bishops and priests, while others insisted that early Christianity had recognized only ministers and deacons. Historical writings from the early centuries of the Church were examined in support of these arguments, though many of those texts were later discovered to contain alterations or unreliable material. The conflict between episcopal authority and the Presbyterian system became one of the defining religious struggles in Scotland. Attempts by later monarchs to impose different forms of church governance only deepened these divisions. Galloway played an important role in these conflicts. During the 17th century, the region became closely associated with the Covenanting movement, which defended the Presbyterian form of worship against royal interference. Many inhabitants suffered harsh persecution during this turbulent period. Military repression was severe. People suspected of supporting the Covenanters were hunted down, imprisoned, or executed. Entire communities lived under constant threat. These hardships left lasting scars across the region. Economic consequences followed as well. By the end of the 17th century, parts of Galloway had fallen into deep poverty. Farms that would later command high rents could barely find tenants willing to pay the taxes required to maintain them. Yet even during these dark years, the people of the region remained deeply attached to their religious convictions. Their struggle reflected a larger truth repeated throughout history. Whenever authorities attempt to force a religious system upon a population, resistance almost always follows. Before leaving this part of Galloway's story, one more misunderstanding needs to be cleared away. Many people later came to speak as if all Covenanters in the region were Cameronians. That is not correct. The Covenanting movement in Galloway began decades before the Cameronians appeared. Its roots in the district go back to 1638, when the National Covenant was signed, and by the following year preparations were already underway to raise forces across the kingdom. The people of Galloway had entered the struggle long before the name of Richard Cameron became attached to a later and more radical phase of resistance. Another major outbreak followed in 1666, driven by anger at the conduct of government troops. A local clash at Dalry helped ignite a wider rising, and from there the district was pulled once more into a religious and political crisis. That movement also belonged to the older Covenanting tradition, not to the later Cameronian identity. Richard Cameron himself came from Fife, not Galloway, and his role belongs to a much shorter and more concentrated episode. He had once been associated with Episcopalianism, before moving firmly into the Presbyterian cause. He later received authority to preach as part of the Scottish Church, but his views quickly hardened around the spiritual independence of the Church and the refusal to accept royal control in sacred matters. Disputes with the more moderate clergy pushed him further outward. He went to the Dutch Republic, where many Scottish religious exiles and sympathisers had gathered, and there he was ordained. When he returned to Scotland in 1680, he did so as a far more uncompromising figure. In June of that year, at Sanquhar, he and a small band publicly renounced allegiance to Charles II. It was an open act of defiance, and the government responded at once. Cameron and his followers were hunted down, and within a month they were overtaken at Aird's Moss. The encounter ended in defeat, and Cameron was killed. His movement had burned brightly, but only for a very short time. He and his brother were not men of Galloway, and their story, though important, should not be confused with the larger Covenanting history of the district. The established Scottish Church itself did not reject monarchy as an institution. Its central argument was narrower and more precise. It rejected the king's claim to be head of the Church in spiritual matters. That distinction mattered greatly, Yet governments repeatedly pushed the issue further. One of the most damaging mistakes of the age was the imposition of the test oath, which many people refused because they believed it would force them to deny essential elements of their faith. Even some Episcopalians hesitated before it. Any government that tries to compel people to renounce deeply held religious convictions creates danger for itself, and Scotland was no exception. At the beginning of the 18th century, another religious disturbance in Galloway drew attention, though this time the issue was more local in origin. The central figure was John McMillan, minister of Balmaghie. He defied the authority of the church, was deposed, and was expected to step aside for the man appointed to replace him. He refused. Instead, he remained in control of the parish, supported by followers who at times appeared armed. The authorities proved too weak to remove him effectively, and for roughly 15 years he held on in open defiance of those placed above him. In the end, he surrendered the parish voluntarily and moved on. His supporters became known as McMillanites, but in principle they stood very close to the same uncompromising ground as the Cameronians. Once he had left his parish and begun preaching more widely, the distinction narrowed further, and those associated with him came to be absorbed into the same broad religious tradition. In time, they were more commonly known as Reformed Presbyterians. This illustrates how Galloway repeatedly became a home for stern forms of religious dissent, especially when local people believed that the established authorities had surrendered principle for convenience. The question of land in Galloway must also be understood if the region's history is to make sense. In this district, legal superiority and actual ownership were often not the same thing. The formal superiority of land might belong to the crown, to the church, or to great lords who had received rights through charters. Yet the soil itself could still be occupied and worked by older families who considered themselves the true possessors. This separation between paper authority and lived possession caused endless trouble, especially in a land so often shaken by war, rebellion, confiscation, and political change. Ancient families who were not close to the court, or who lacked allies in the church, often found themselves exposed when disorder came. In later centuries, it became almost shocking to see how many charters were granted to certain powerful houses across parish after parish, even though those lands remained in practice under the control of others. On parchment, whole districts could appear to belong to one magnate family. On the ground, the reality might be very different. Families such as the Gordons of Kenmure and the Maxwells appear repeatedly in this kind of paper superiority. Following the true line of possession through such a maze is now one of the hardest parts of Galloway's history. This pattern did not begin late. It runs through the record from the first age of charters. A court favourite, or church ally, might obtain a grant for lands which neither he nor his descendants would actually control for generations, if ever. But the charter remained, and at the right moment it could be used as a weapon. Among Gaelic populations especially, this created deep resentment. Many people did not naturally accept the feudal idea that ownership could be transformed so completely by a sealed document. To them, written title could seem like nothing more than an arrogant claim on sheepskin. But the state and the church increasingly treated such charters as decisive, and over time they gave legal force to dispossession. Some later writers praised this process as if it represented order, civilization, and the honourable foundation of modern property. That is only one side of the story. It is true that many later noble and landed families traced their legal standing to grants confirmed in the medieval and post-medieval kingdom. It is also true that these same processes brought in new institutions, new forms of law, and closer connections with the wider European world. Yet none of that erases what happened to the older holders of the land. Foreign adventurers, court favourites, church-backed newcomers, and politically useful settlers were often established at the expense of long-rooted local families. The legal system that followed may have been stable for its winners, but it did not feel honourable to those who lost their inheritance. This transformation had begun especially under David I, whose rule helped accelerate the settlement of Anglo-Norman, Flemish, and other outside elements throughout Scotland. These men were not brought in one by one merely because they had earned special merit. Land itself became the lure. The promise of territory, power, and advancement drew a steady stream of foreign entrants into the kingdom. Galloway felt that intrusion with particular force. The old Celtic owners were gradually pushed aside, not always by direct violence, but often by grants, legal manipulation, ecclesiastical pressure, and the growing weight of a feudal order that did not reflect older local customs. In the Highlands, where clan society developed along its own path, people often took the name of the lord set over them, whether he was native or foreign. This made the situation even more confusing because a shared surname did not necessarily mean shared blood. In many Highland clans, one name covered people of very mixed origins. Galloway followed a different pattern. Its population remained strongly Gaelic for a long time, but surnames developed there more gradually and in a more varied form, much as they did in Ireland. Many of the old surnames of Galloway are distinctive to the district and still appear across many social levels. Some may reflect branches of once larger families. Others were likely adopted through tenancy, service, or local association. The destruction of records and family Bibles in later troubled centuries only deepened that uncertainty. The countryside itself explains much of this. Younger sons of local families often remained on farms as kindly tenants, while their descendants spread into different occupations without leaving the district. That is one reason why the same surname can appear in very different conditions, from landowners to labourers. Illegitimacy must also be counted as part of the picture, since children often took the father's name, further widening the spread of particular surnames. Over time, the descendants of foreign settlers came to dominate the ownership of the soil, while the older Celtic proprietors largely vanished. Yet the ruling foreign lines of the earliest period did not always endure very long either. Many of the grand houses that first rose through royal favour disappeared after only a few generations. This leads into another illusion that later families often embraced: the belief that tracing descent to a Norman follower of William the Conqueror automatically proved high and superior blood. That idea collapses under scrutiny. The army that entered England in 1066 was not composed solely of noble lords of ancient distinction. A very large part of it consisted of restless adventurers, men of fortune, opportunists, and fighters drawn from many regions of France and beyond. Many were known only by the places they came from. Some had no settled surnames at all, until they were rewarded with confiscated land. From those lands they took new names. What later seemed like ancient nobility often began in seizure and chance. The baronial dignity that later ages admired was built upon dispossession. In England, the Norman settlement swept away much of the older landholding order, stripped nobles and clergy alike, and distributed vast estates to men who had won the favour of the conqueror. The same broad pattern, though under different conditions, later echoed in Scotland. There too, kings and reforming elites used land as an instrument of policy. The church supported the process, foreign families profited from it, and native populations were left to adjust or be broken. When later histories praise the rise of those houses without looking at the suffering and displacement beneath them, they tell only the story of the victors. The result was not the same in every part of Scotland. Lowland society developed differently from the Highlands, and Galloway again followed its own path. Norse blood, Gaelic blood, and later outside elements mixed in the district in a distinctive way. Gaelic remained the dominant language there for a very long time, and the older clan naming pattern of the Highlands never fully took hold. Galloway kept its own rich spread of surnames, many of them with clear Irish parallels, which reflects its deep connection to the Western Gaelic world. The old belief that Celtic peoples were merely barbarous collapses as soon as their material culture is examined seriously. A people who could build complex strongholds, shape fine gold objects, organise royal courts, and sustain religious institutions were not living in mere savagery. Long before later feudal settlers arrived, societies in Ireland and the West had already developed political structures, craftsmanship, and sacred centres of impressive sophistication. The Irish Scots who moved into Galloway were not nameless wanderers from an uncivilised fringe. They came from a world that had already known kingship, church foundations, metalwork, and long cultural memory. Another important question concerns the first earls in Scotland. Later writers often tried to connect them directly to the older Celtic mormares of the Highlands, as though the early earldoms were simply the old order in a new form. In many cases, that does not appear to be true. The Norse impact on northern and coastal Scotland was too great to ignore, and in many districts the older rulers were displaced. The title of Earl itself derives from the Norse Jarl. That alone should warn against assuming continuity. The first earls who appear in the records often seem to belong to a newer order, one shaped by Norse, Anglo-Norman or otherwise mixed aristocratic elements rather than by a clean line of descent from the Mormaers. Again and again, titles passed by marriage into foreign houses, or else were revived later under entirely different families. Angus, Buchan, Carrick, Lennox, Caithness, Ross, Sutherland, and others all reveal versions of this pattern. Male lines failed. Heiresses carried titles and lands into other families. Old earldoms were recreated under new circumstances. In some cases, even the names were later revived in forms that obscured how complete the break had been. The result is a Scottish nobility whose oldest dignities often seem ancient, yet in practice were repeatedly interrupted, transferred, or rebuilt. The same instability affected the great foreign families who had first risen in Scotland. Many vanished altogether. The Morvilles, once immensely powerful and holders of the constableship of Scotland, disappeared so completely that even the site of their main castle became uncertain. The Sully line, the Viponts, the Umfravilles, and others rose high and then faded away. Some lost everything. Some ended in poverty. Most left little in public memory, beyond their names in old records. Their fall is a reminder that the fortunes granted by kings were often short-lived, even when they seemed overwhelming at the time. Modern titles have only added to the confusion. Some came through the female line, some by indirect inheritance, some by restoration, and some by entirely new creation under old names. In many cases, surnames and titles were transposed, revived, or adopted in ways that make families appear older or more continuous than they truly are. This happened in Scotland as it did in England, where even the most famous honours often passed far away from the original male line. The prestige of a title survived, but the bloodline behind it often did not. Galloway itself provides a clear example. The present Earls of Galloway are not successors to the old medieval lords of the district in any direct sense. Their family gained the lands of Garleys early in the 15th century, but the lordship of Galloway had already followed a different path and had come to an end with the fall of the Douglases in 1455. That lordship lasted only 86 years under the Douglas line, even though several successive holders occupied it during that brief span. Much later, under James VI, titles themselves became objects of sale. Court influence, royal favour, and money all helped determine who rose. The rise of Robert Kerr at court illustrates the atmosphere of the time. He was advanced largely because of personal favour, and because those around the king thought he could be used for their own ends. But his ascent went further than they intended. His career became notorious, and his fall was equally dramatic. In the middle of such intrigues, men from Galloway also tried to buy or secure titles for themselves. Sir John McDowell of Garthland sought elevation through court influence and paid heavily in hopes of becoming Lord or Earl of Galloway. But the disgrace of his patron ruined the scheme. Another candidate, Sir Alexander Stewart of Garlies, met with better fortune and was first made Lord Garlies and later Earl of Galloway. Such was the atmosphere of title-making in the early 17th century. The sale of honours did not stop there. Baronetcies too were created in quantity, both in England and in Scotland, often under the formal excuse of supporting colonial or military schemes, while in practice functioning as ways to raise money. Even the supposed grant of vast lands in Nova Scotia became part of this theatre. Ceremony and parchment dressed up what was, at base, a commercial transaction. Heraldry presents another field where later appearances can mislead. Many old Scottish families never registered their arms formally, even after legislation attempted to force them to do so. Some neglected it out of indifference, some from distance, and some because they disliked placing ancient bearings on the same formal level as newly adopted arms. In Galloway, isolation from Edinburgh and the region's long troubles contributed heavily to this neglect. Families who had once borne arms for centuries often saw little reason to hurry into a bureaucratic system during or after periods of persecution, confiscation, and instability. Finally, there is the question of language. Galloway was home to more than one tongue across the centuries, which is exactly what should be expected in a region shaped by so many waves of settlement and influence. Yet the Celtic voice remained strongest for the longest time. Gaelic was still spoken in Galloway in the 16th century, and likely long before that as well. Earlier still, a Brittonic Celtic speech had once been used there. Some later writers doubted that Gaelic truly survived in the district, but this view ignores both migration from Ireland and the broader linguistic reality of southwest Scotland. The confusion comes partly from the fact that official documents, proclamations, and legal records were often written in lowland Scots during the age of the Reformation and after. But an official language is not always the same as the language spoken in homes and fields. The same thing had happened elsewhere in Britain, where administrative tongues often masked the speech of the people. Gaelic religious texts were produced for Western and Highland audiences, while the lack of an early full Bible in Gaelic did not mean the language was absent. More likely, Galloway lived for a time in a bilingual state, with Gaelic and Lowland Scots existing side by side, until the latter slowly gained ground. From everything that survives in the record, the population of Galloway was overwhelmingly Celtic in character. That remained true even after later invasions, migrations, and political changes. The balance may have shifted over the centuries, especially in the modern period, but the deeper character of the district was shaped by Celtic peoples. The movement of settlers from Ireland did not create something entirely new. In many ways, it marked the return of closely related, Gaelic-speaking communities whose wider kindred had once occupied large parts of Scotland. Before later powers remade the map, the Strathclyde Britons had already ruled their own lands for generations, and the Celtic imprint on the southwest remained strong enough to survive layer after layer of change. The place names of Galloway and Ayrshire still preserve that older world. Many of them are more purely Celtic, and in some cases more easily understood through Gaelic learning than names found in parts of the Highlands that later came to be seen as the heartland of Gaelic Scotland. The region also preserved a blending of Brittonic and Gaelic speech, which reveals a long period of overlap rather than sudden replacement. One tradition from the late 17th century captures this vividly. When Highland soldiers were quartered on Presbyterian communities in Galloway, they were startled to discover that local people could address them in Gaelic. That moment says a great deal. It shows that the language had not vanished from the district and that beneath later political changes, older cultural continuities still remained alive. Alongside this cultural continuity, Galloway also developed an early framework of legal order. In some respects, formal government seems to have reached the district as early as it did elsewhere in Scotland. By the late 12th century, royal authority was already being expressed through officials such as sheriffs and bailiffs operating in Galloway, Carrick, and neighbouring areas. Yet this did not mean that local society immediately abandoned its older habits. The people of Galloway continued for a long time to conduct many of their own affairs according to established Celtic custom, and judges were appointed to deal with such matters. Official government and older local law existed side by side, sometimes uneasily, for centuries. That older order lingered well into the reign of James VI. One example is the practice known as calp, a customary gift or due paid by tenants to their landlords. It survived long enough to require suppression by statute. This tells the story of Galloway in miniature. The district was never shaped by one system alone. Royal government expanded, feudal procedures spread, sheriffs and justiciars appeared. Yet underneath all that, an older social world kept its grip. The institutions of the kingdom could be imposed, but they did not instantly erase local memory or inherited practice. During the late 13th century, when Edward I of England pushed his authority deep into Scotland, Galloway was drawn directly into that process. A number of men in the district swore fealty to him and received writs restoring or confirming their property. English officials were appointed, including justiciars and sheriffs. But even then, the older local laws were not immediately swept aside. The conqueror could place administrators in office, but the habits of the district still ran deeper than royal command. When Robert Bruce later emerged victorious, one of the earliest signs of his policy in Galloway was a charter confirming liberties granted to the people there. He understood, like others before him, that the district could not simply be ruled by decree without taking account of its distinct traditions. A more serious narrowing of local autonomy came in the 14th century with the creation of the Earldom of Wigtown. That change reduced the independent space in which older Galloway customs had survived. The county was gathered under a new framework of regality, and Wigtown was confirmed as the Shire town. This was one more step in the long transformation of Galloway, from a land with strong regional habits into a district more tightly bound into the structure of the Scottish kingdom. When the earldom later passed by sale to the Douglases, the same privileges passed with it. Offices, jurisdictions, and local power were increasingly concentrated in the hands of magnates, and the district's older freedoms were slowly hemmed in. The sheriffdom of Wigtownshire offers a good example of how these arrangements evolved. It moved through the hands of noble families and local officials, often tied closely to service at court or loyalty to the ruling power. Eventually, it came into the possession of the Agnews of Lochnaw, who held it for generations. Yet even that apparently stable inheritance was vulnerable to the religious and political storms of later times. In the 17th century, the office was taken from its holder for refusing the test oath, and was given instead to men favoured by the crown. After the Revolution it was restored, and later, like many hereditary jurisdictions in Scotland, it was abolished and compensated in money. In this way, offices that had once embodied personal, local authority gradually became part of a more centralised state. The magistrates of the burghs, by contrast, continued to exercise their civic roles with less disruption. But even there, the district could not escape wider national tensions. When the terms of union between Scotland and England were publicly burned in Dumfries in 1706, the landowners of Galloway do not appear to have taken a leading part. Yet the effects of the union were deeply felt. At first, the measure brought bitterness and hardship, not prosperity. Only much later did many Scots begin to feel its advantages. Indeed, the settlement was fragile enough that it nearly came undone when Scottish peers pushed for reversal a few years later. Much of the support for the Jacobite Rising of 1715 came not simply from devotion to the Stewards, but from anger and disappointment caused by the Union itself. In Galloway, the houses of Kenmure and Nithsdale were drawn into that rebellion, and the burden of its aftermath can still be traced in the legal record of the district through mortgages, debts, and changes in ownership. Economic disaster followed political unrest. The failure of a major bank in the 18th century ruined many families and added another layer of loss to a region already worn down by conflict. Galloway's history is often remembered in terms of war, religion, or old families, but the financial collapse of estates and the burdening of land also played a huge part in reshaping society. The story of the district is not only one of kings, lords, and battles. It is also one of mortgages, forfeitures, quiet decline, and property passing from one hand to another under pressure. Even the name Galloway carries the memory of a mixed past. It has been explained in different ways, but one long-standing interpretation sees it as the land of mixed peoples, combining the idea of foreign settlers with that of native Celts. Whether every detail of that interpretation can be proved or not, it matches the historical character of the district. Galloway was never the possession of one people alone. Norse influence, Celtic continuity, later feudal settlers, and church power all met there and left their mark. The region that later became Wigtownshire and Kirkcudbrightshire was shaped by centuries of overlap, rather than by a single clean inheritance. Wigtownshire, the western half of Galloway, is bounded by sea on much of its outer edge and divided from the eastern half by the Cree and the Bay of Wigtown. It is a district of rivers, inlets, lochs, and long coastal openings. The Cree itself rises from upland waters and works southward in a winding course before reaching the bay. The Bladnoch flows from lochs and hills in the interior, joined by other streams before meeting the sea near Wigtown. The Luce runs across another part of the county and enters Luce Bay near Glenluce. These are not merely features on a map. They shaped settlement, movement, economy, and defence. Salmon and sea trout filled these waters, while smaller burns held trout in abundance. Even the little spurling, a delicate fish of local interest, belonged to this watery landscape. The district is also marked by religious remains. Great abbeys and priories once stood there, but so too did smaller chapels scattered through the countryside. Among the oldest and most striking is the ruined chapel at Cruggleton, near Garlieston. Its form suggests deep connections with early Irish church architecture, which makes sense in a district where Irish-Scottish influence had once been so strong. Though later neglect allowed parts of it to collapse, it still stands as one of the most revealing survivals in Galloway. Its very stones speak of a period before later Norman and feudal forms fully reshaped the region. The Western District also contains major bays and sea locks that were central to its life. Loch Ryan, deeply set inland, is one of the few true saltwater locks of its kind in the area. Wigtown Bay and Luce Bay open wide to the sea and helped define the county's maritime character. Shell banks accumulated at river mouths and provided material for lime burning, linking the shoreline directly to local agriculture. Freshwater lochs lie scattered across the interior, some with trout, others with pike and perch. Royal burghs, harbours, and fishing communities gave the county a varied life that was never wholly inland and never wholly maritime, but always balanced between the two. The eastern half, later called Kirkcudbrightshire, developed under somewhat different conditions. Its name is traditionally tied to St Cuthbert, though the details of that association have long been debated. What matters most is that the district belonged to the older world of the Irish-Scottish Church and the wider Celtic religious sphere. Cuthbert himself, whatever the exact truth of his birthplace, belonged to that early northern religious landscape. He was first clearly known in the monastic life of Britain, moved through key religious centres of the age, and eventually became one of the great saints of the north. The persistence of his name in the district reflects not some passing fashion, but a deep ecclesiastical memory, tied to the age before the later Romanising reforms of medieval Scotland. Kirkcudbrightshire stretches farther and more ruggedly than the western half. It is larger, more mountainous, and in many respects wilder. To the west it meets Wigtownshire along the Cree and the Bay. To the east it borders Dumfriesshire and the Nith. To the north it rises toward Ayrshire. To the south it faces the Solway along a coastline often bold, hard and exposed. Its northern uplands are especially rough, a country of hills, cattle, sheep and scattered arable strips. The more fertile southern fringe long held the main grain-producing lands and the principal religious foundations. Old abbeys and priories, or their ruins, remained there long after their original power had gone. Its rivers also helped define its character. The Ken flows southward into Loch Ken and then, leaving it, becomes the Dee before meeting the sea below Kirkcudbright. The Ur rises farther north and descends toward the Solway. The Fleet, with its branching waters, runs through striking country before entering Wigtown Bay. These rivers supported fish, provided routes, and shaped settlement just as surely as their western counterparts. Lochs lie everywhere across the district, more than in almost any other part of Scotland, and many of them would later prove to hide traces of an even older human story. Because Kirkcudbrightshire is more mountainous, it must have been the harsher district in ancient times. Wigtownshire, though not without hills, appears flatter when seen from the east. Yet in earlier centuries it too had been heavily wooded and far less open than later generations knew it. At the beginning of the modern age, much of it still consisted of moorland, broken only by patches of cultivation. The east, though rougher, contained fertile strips, especially along the south coast, and grain must have been grown there in meaningful quantity. At one stage in the English occupation under Edward I, wheat from Kirkcudbright was sent out to other regions to be milled and then returned for military use. That small detail reveals both agricultural capacity and the practical limitations of local processing at the time. Later charters show how closely mills were tied to feudal authority. Tenants were often bound to use particular mills and to pay for the privilege. The system could outlast the original conditions that created it, surviving as a charge or legal claim long after the old social order had changed. This is one more example of how the administrative and economic history of Galloway remained embedded in documents and obligations even when the landscape and population had moved on. An older observer from the early modern period, writing about Galloway, seems not always to have fully understood the deeper origins of the district's families and people. That is hardly surprising. Much of that history was already clouded even then. But the land itself still preserves some of the clearest evidence. One of the most striking features is the large number of circular earthworks and hill forts, often marked by ditches and ramparts, and usually placed on commanding heights. Some are known by names derived from the Gaelic word for a fort. Others are called moats, though that term can also refer to judicial mounds rather than defended sites. These forts are numerous in Galloway and clearly belong to a much older age. Their parallels stretch across Wales, southern Scotland, parts of Ireland, and farther north into other districts. This distribution strongly supports the idea that the peoples who built or used them belong to the wider Celtic world. In Ireland especially, such forts are abundant and often more elaborate, with several rings of defence. Galloway usually has simpler forms, though there are exceptions. One particular site near the coast, with multiple inner ramparts, has long puzzled observers. Yet its form points not to some later foreign invader, but to the Irish-Scottish world that so deeply influenced the southwest. Other ancient remains deepen that picture. A few vitrified forts survive, where stonework appears melted by great heat, though exactly how that effect was produced remains uncertain. Crannogs, or artificial island dwellings in lochs, have also been discovered in the district. Some came to light only after drainage work in more recent centuries. These lake dwellings connect Galloway to a much wider prehistoric world, since similar structures have been found elsewhere in Britain, in continental Europe and beyond. The district is also rich in cairns, though not all belong to the same type or purpose. Some were sepulchral, others may have been connected to ritual. Rocking stones, too, survive in places and have long been associated with Celtic religious landscapes. Then, there are the mysterious cup and ring markings cut into rock surfaces, whose meaning remains obscure but whose presence adds yet another layer of antiquity to the land. The term stewartry, still used for Kirkwood-Brightshire, belongs to a later administrative age. It likely arose from the presence of the king's steward in the district, when royal revenues were being gathered and managed. Some have thought such stewardries were a later creation, but examples elsewhere show that the title and function existed earlier. In this case, the district seems to have become associated with the steward because it was treated as a royal possession after the forfeitures and redistributions that followed the age of Bruce and Balliol. The name stuck, and with it came a distinctive identity that lasted long after the original circumstances had faded. The sea around Galloway has always demanded respect. The tides of the Solway and the waters off the Galloway coast are not gentle, and anyone who treated them lightly risked disaster. Stories, later made famous in literature, captured that danger vividly, describing riders fleeing the incoming tide as if speed alone could save them. Though fiction naturally adds drama, the truth behind it is solid enough. Along this coast, the sea can move with remarkable force, and in certain places it advances with a speed that leaves very little room for error. Under ordinary spring tides, the current commonly runs fast enough to trouble even experienced seafarers, and during neap tides, it still carries enough strength to be dangerous. In some stretches, the movement is stronger still. Around exposed headlands, the flow tightens, collides, and rises into rough races and broken water, especially when wind and tide oppose one another. Off Burrow Head, the sea can become particularly violent when the ebb meets a hard westerly wind. near the Mull of Galloway, where tidal streams are compressed, and the shape of the coast drives the water into narrower passages, the sea throws up dangerous overfalls and racing currents that can extend far from land. At the head of the Solway, the current can be fiercer again. There, with the tide in full strength and the wind pressing behind it, the speed becomes enough to explain why so many old stories about the Solway carry a tone of fear. Creetown and the ferry routes nearby have also long been known for powerful moving water. Spates in the rivers and changes in the wind can increase the force still further, and the tidal reach pushes deep inland. The character of the coast itself teaches caution. Galloway is not a shore to be judged by calm weather alone. For all its dramatic landscape, Galloway never possessed the great mineral riches that transformed so many other parts of Scotland. In one sense, this limited its economic rise. In another, it preserved the appearance of the country and spared much of it from the harsh industrial growth that altered other districts. Lead and iron have been found in parts of Galloway, but coal in any important quantity was not part of its natural wealth. That absence mattered greatly. Without coal nearby, even where ore existed, working it on a profitable scale became difficult. Lead was believed to run in a broad line from the Minnegaff country toward the Lead Hills beyond. Mines near Newton Stewart were worked at times, but not all produced encouraging results. Iron ore was found in several places as well, including parts of Kirkwood-Brightshire, yet the cost of working and transport limited its success. Reports of richer deposits elsewhere in the district appeared from time to time, but much of that promise never turned into lasting prosperity. Galloway's strength never lay underground in the way that it did in coal and iron regions farther east and south. Stone, however, was another matter. Granite is one of the defining materials of the district, especially in the hill country, and in many places it lies close enough to the surface to shape both the landscape and local building. Whinstone and other hard rocks also appear widely. The granite quarries of places such as Dalbeattie became especially famous. Their stone travelled far beyond Galloway. For years it was shipped in quantity to major ports, and its quality was such that it was used in major works far away from the district where it was cut. In this sense, Galloway did export its strength, though not in the form of coal or metal. Long before quarries and mines, the district had been known for something else entirely: forest. Early Galloway was heavily wooded. In the eastern half, that older woodland character remained easier to trace because substantial signs of it survived in the ground and in the pattern of place names. In the west, the evidence often lies hidden in bogs and mosses, where buried trunks of oak and birch still appear. These remains leave no doubt that the country once carried dense woodland over enormous stretches of land. The names of many places preserve the memory of woods that disappeared centuries ago. That older forest world supported animals long vanished from Scotland. Wolves roamed there. Wild swine moved through the oak woods, feeding where acorns were abundant. Large wild cattle were also known, often described in old writing as fierce, swift, and larger than ordinary domestic beasts. They were likely close kin to the white or pale wild cattle that survived much later in protected parks elsewhere in Britain. These creatures were not like the black, hornless Galloway cattle, familiar in more recent times. They belonged to an older landscape, one in which the forest still dominated, and man had not yet pushed the wild entirely to the edge. Deer were once common too, and their remains have been found in different parts of the district, especially in boggy ground where ancient deposits preserved them. Even elk appear to have existed in the region at an earlier stage. One antler recovered from the River Cree offered striking proof of that lost world. The oak woods, mosses, open glades, and river margins formed a habitat far richer in wildlife than the later countryside of enclosed farms and grazed fields. Domestic animals were present in large numbers as well. Cattle, sheep, goats, and horses all belonged to the economy of early Galloway. In wooded country, semi-wild horses could be found moving in herds. Hogs appear to have been especially important as a source of meat. The abundance of forest mast made swine husbandry practical on a large scale, and references survive showing how central cattle, hogs, and dairy produce were to the dues and renders expected from the district. Galloway was not merely a place of wild nature. It was also an old pastoral land where people, herds, woods, and waters were closely bound together. There has sometimes been a tendency to imagine the trees of old Galloway as little more than stunted growths, twisted by wind and poor soil. That view only suits certain exposed places. In rough coastal stretches and on rocky ground, such trees certainly existed, and a few reminders survive in the wilder northern country. But elsewhere, the natural woods of oak and birch were clearly capable of producing strong and impressive timber. Galloway was not some barren edgeland covered only in scrub. In many areas it had real forest. The destruction of that woodland came over a long period, but war played a large part. Military campaigns, especially those involving English forces moving through the south of Scotland, brought deliberate felling and burning. Armies wanted open ground, safer lines of advance, and fewer places for resistance to hide. Vast quantities of timber disappeared this way. Over time, the district changed from a wooded land into something far barer, and later, rulers became alarmed enough by the loss to pass laws aimed at forcing replanting. Again and again, statutes tried to make landowners and tenants plant trees, hedges, and broom. These laws show how complete the transformation had become. By the later medieval and early modern periods, the loss of woodland was being openly lamented. Timber had become scarce enough to attract legislative control. There were rules against cutting green wood, against careless burning, and later even severe punishments for deliberate destruction. The anxiety behind such measures is easy to understand. Forest was not only beauty or hunting ground. It meant fuel, shelter, building material, and economic strength. Once it was gone, the loss was felt everywhere. As the forest disappeared, so too did the great wild animals that depended on them. Wolves, long feared and hunted, gradually vanished. Wild swine and the older cattle disappeared as well. Deer, once so common, retreated and were eventually lost from the district. The old forested Galloway of wolves, boars, and great herds gave way to another kind of countryside, one shaped more by pasture, tillage, and managed estates than by deep woodland. In the 17th century, the products of Galloway reflected this pastoral character. Cattle, small horses, sheep, goats in some rough districts, wool, coarse grain, oats, and hay formed the basis of local life. The land, especially in its upland parts, was better suited to pasture than to extensive tillage, and that reality shaped the economy. England was a major market for cattle. Sheep were driven elsewhere for sale. Wool and cloth moved out through fairs and trading routes. The district produced enough, but it remained a countryside economy rather than an industrial one. Customs of daily life from that period reveal a world both practical and rough-edged. Tobacco was so popular that sharing it became almost expected. Whey was stored up for winter drink once milk grew scarce. Hides were tanned with local materials when bark was not at hand. Shoemakers often worked not in permanent shops, but by travelling to the houses of their customers and staying there while making shoes for the family. It was a society where many trades still moved through the countryside rather than remaining fixed in towns. Agriculture advanced sharply in later centuries. By the early 19th century, observers were already looking back in amazement at how much rents and values had risen. Prices that once seemed ordinary for sheep, cows, horses, oatmeal, beef, and mutton belonged to another age. Improvement, enclosure, and changing farming methods transformed both the land and its expectations. Rents climbed, public burdens increased, and farming became a more demanding business, tied more closely to market conditions than to older habits. Dairy farming expanded significantly, and cheese-making in Galloway reached a very high standard. Horse breeding also became an important part of the district's reputation. The old, small Galloway horse, likely shaped by long northern influences, was admired for strength, activity, sound feet, and good temper. Later, the breeding of Clydesdales rose to great prominence, and fine animals were produced in quantity. The district became known for valuable bloodstock as much as for its traditional rural character. The cattle of Galloway also changed under pressure from newer agricultural priorities. The old black Galloway breed, hardy and well suited to the land, found itself increasingly crossed or displaced in some places by breeds thought to give more milk. Large dairy farms became more common, while grazing expanded as grain prices weakened. Another profitable trade developed in the fattening of Irish cattle, brought across the short sea passage. The sea route between Northern Ireland and southwest Scotland made that movement practical, and Galloway benefited from it, At the same time, more moorland and rough ground were reclaimed and brought into cultivation. The countryside changed visibly. These improvements were intended to yield more rent and more return. Yet, they also altered the older appearance of the district. And despite all this effort, later generations of farmers often struggled. Too many farms had once been taken at inflated rents by men with money, but little understanding of the realities of agriculture. The dream of becoming a gentleman farmer ruined more than one outsider who entered the district with money and left it with less. Better transport by sea and later by rail brought advantages, opening links with Liverpool, Glasgow, Belfast and beyond. Trade moved more easily, but the underlying truth remained stubborn. Good farming did not always mean profitable farming. Markets could turn against the cultivator just as surely as bad weather or poor soil. In this, Galloway shared the wider rural difficulties of modern Scotland. The district was once celebrated as one of the finest mixed shooting countries in Scotland, but that reputation faded. Reclamation, changes in land use, and later legal changes all reduced the old abundance of game. Grouse held on better than many other birds, helped by their habits and breeding patterns, but partridges, pheasants, and black game declined in many places. Traditional shooting over dogs gave way increasingly to large, organised parties, lines of beaters, and more mechanical slaughter. Driving became fashionable, allowing heavy bags with less skill and less effort. Old sporting standards were replaced by the simple boast of numbers killed. Poaching also changed in scale and character. Egg stealing, especially from species whose eggs fetched money, further weakened stocks. Easier transport meant illegal game could quickly be sent to large markets. Hares and rabbits suffered too, not only from legitimate control but from constant pressure for sale or food. Over time, Galloway lost the status it had once enjoyed as a first-rate sporting district. It still offered good ground in places, but the older richness had passed. One more feature of the district deserves notice: adders. Whatever saints or missionaries may once have done elsewhere, Galloway never lost these venomous reptiles. They remain part of the countryside, sometimes of considerable size. And though not always common, they are dangerous enough to demand respect. When disturbed, they rise, hiss, and strike in a way that leaves no doubt about their nature. Their bite can be serious, especially for children or animals. Folk remedies and practical cures have always been part of country life, and one old treatment long trusted for bites involved the leaves of the ash tree, boiled and used warm as a fomentation. Whether every old remedy deserves confidence is another matter, but the fact that such treatments survived tells its own story. In a district as old, varied, and deeply rural as Galloway, knowledge was often carried in practice long before it was ever written down. One of the first things many visitors notice in Galloway, and especially in the Rhines, is the striking physical presence of the people. For generations, the district was known for producing tall, strongly built men, with broad frames, solid muscle, and an appearance shaped by rural work, hard weather, and a long tradition of outdoor life. Men of unusual height were never rare there. Yet, despite that obvious physical strength, Galloway never sent large numbers into military service, compared with other parts of Scotland. That contrast has often been remarked upon. Perhaps part of the reason lies in the fact that regular military life was less visible in the district. The constant presence of barracks, marching regiments, and recruiting culture was never as deeply woven into Galloway life as it was elsewhere. The old martial spirit had not vanished, but it did not always turn itself into enlistment. Beneath those outward traits, older Celtic characteristics remained long visible in the district, and even after centuries of change. Yet those older features did not stand still. They were slowly weakened by the arrival of new people, new customs, and new economic habits. The land itself had long since passed, mostly into the hands of families not originally Celtic, and in more modern times another layer was added as farmers and labourers came in from Ayrshire and elsewhere. With them came different habits of work, different ideas of management, and a more mixed population. Some would have called that progress. Others would have seen it as the gradual thinning of an older local character. What is certain is that Galloway became increasingly mixed, not only in blood, but in outlook. And yet, even as the population changed, one older habit remained remarkably strong: affection for the district itself. Galloway inspired a powerful local loyalty. People whose surnames clearly showed that they were not descended from the oldest stock of the region still came to speak and write about it with deep warmth. The old attachment to place proved stronger than ancestry alone. That says something important about Galloway. Its landscape, its history, and its atmosphere seem to have a way of drawing people into its identity. It is a rural country first and foremost, and even its towns have long been influenced by that rural character. The result is a sense of belonging that often reaches beyond origin. Newcomers did not merely live there, many came to feel that they belonged there. At the same time, the population began to decline. That was not unique to Galloway, but the district felt it clearly. Economic pressure lay behind much of it, especially the falling fortunes of agriculture. Farming no longer brought the security it once had, and in a countryside so dependent on the land, that made a real difference. Some parts managed to hold their numbers better than others, especially where industry or trade gave support. But the general drift was unmistakable. The countryside was not filling, it was thinning. Galloway also holds an important place in literary memory because it provided material, directly or indirectly, for several of the great novels of Sir Walter Scott. The district echoes through some of his most famous fiction, and in more than one case, real people and real locations from Galloway were transformed into literary figures and settings. One of the most touching examples is the woman whose story helped inspire the character, later known as Jeanie Deans. Her real life belonged to the ground of southwest Scotland, and the memorial raised over her grave became part of that long bond between Scott and the region he used so powerfully in fiction. But the exact nature of Scott's connection to Galloway has often been misunderstood. A long-standing question asks whether he ever truly travelled through the district in any meaningful way before using it in his fiction. It has been suggested that, as a young advocate, he once reached Gatehouse on legal business. Even if that happened, the journey appears to have been brief and left almost no living memory behind it. No one in the surrounding families who later had every reason to remember such a visit seems to have known of it. If he did come, it cannot have been a deep exploration of the district. That matters because some of the most vivid Galloway scenes in his work were written many years later. Their power came not from long first-hand residence, but from a combination of imagination, second-hand knowledge, local tradition, correspondence, and scattered personal connections. This helps explain how those novels took shape so quickly. In the case of one of his most famous Galloway tales, the book was said to have been produced in an astonishingly short period. That would have been difficult without some groundwork already gathered for him. He clearly had access to people who knew the district closely and could supply character, incident, setting, and tradition. Among those around him were individuals with intimate ties to the very part of Galloway where some of his scenes are laid. That family connection matters more than it is sometimes given credit for. Through those channels, he likely received the raw material that he later transformed into literature. This does not diminish his genius. Quite the opposite. His greatness lay in what he did with material once it came into his hands. But it is still important to recognise that he was not creating Galloway out of nothing. The district reached him through memory, family talk, local antiquarian interest, and the testimony of those who knew it better than he did. He shaped all that into fiction of lasting power, but the roots were often local and human rather than the result of personal wandering, through every place he described. Not every literary connection was equally reliable. Some of the stories later attached to particular places in Galloway were romanticised well beyond the truth. Events that in reality ended quietly or ordinarily could reappear in fiction as violence, madness, or tragedy. Such transformations helped create some of the unforgettable atmosphere for which Scott is praised, but they also blurred the historical record. A marriage contract, a family paper, or a sober local tradition can sometimes reveal a much less dramatic reality than the version fixed in popular imagination. There were also other people around Scott whose role in gathering Scottish material deserves more recognition. One of them, bound to Galloway through marriage and family connection, had a strong gift for humour, observation, and storytelling. That talent seems to have been appreciated by Scott himself. In fact, there is every reason to think that some of the local colour and rough groundwork for Galloway scenes may have passed through these channels before being elevated into finished literature. The result is a picture of creative collaboration around a central genius, rather than the isolated work of a writer drawing only on his own direct experience. Scott's interest in Galloway also connected with a wider fascination for border history, old weapons, local legend, and family descent. But here again, his authority was not flawless. Like many people of his time, he could be drawn toward attractive theories of origin and lineage that were not always as solid as they appeared. He was especially susceptible when family prestige, old surnames, or romantic notions of ancestry entered the discussion. In such areas, the great novelist sometimes behaved less like a strict historian than like a man willing to favour a pleasing or dignified tradition. This is especially relevant in the case of the Scott name itself. Scott at one point gave support to the idea that the family had deep roots in Galloway, and that the earliest men of the name there represented a true Galwegian origin. Yet the evidence is far less certain than later Pride would have liked. Early appearances of the name do exist, but they do not prove a clean, continuous descent from ancient Galloway stock to the great border house that later bore the name so famously. In fact, the later power of the Scots belongs above all to their rise on the borders, especially after they obtained Branksholm in the 15th century. That acquisition marks the true turning point. From there, their fortune expanded rapidly. The military and political rise of the border Scots was not rooted in the old wars of independence in the way later patriotic imagination sometimes assumed. They did not stand prominently among the great early champions of Scottish liberty. Their real ascent came later, in the unsettled and often lawless world of the borders, where strength, opportunity, and political calculation mattered greatly. Their greatness belonged to that age rather than to the earlier heroic age of Wallace. That distinction matters because later family tradition often tried to draw a longer and nobler line backward than the evidence comfortably allows. Another complication lies in the way surnames and inheritances shifted over time. In Scotland, and certainly in Galloway, it became very common for a family to assume a name or continue a title through marriage, female inheritance, or social advantage, even when the strict male line lay elsewhere. This created endless confusion. Houses could appear to continue when, in fact, only the estate or title survived, carried into another bloodline. A celebrated name remained, but the descent had changed. In some cases, that shift was quietly accepted. In others, it led to later misunderstandings about who truly represented an old family. That habit of taking over surnames through heiresses or inheritance complicated not just one family, but many. Public appearance began to matter more than strict genealogical truth. A powerful name could be preserved even when the bloodline that first made it famous had already passed away in the male line. This was not unique to Galloway, but the district provides many examples of the confusion it caused. The result is that several families sailed under names that were more useful, more dignified, or more convenient than their actual paternal origin would have suggested. That same confusion affected public understanding. People naturally assumed that the holder of a title or the owner of an estate must represent the old family in a simple and direct way. Yet in many cases the reality was far more tangled. The title might have passed through a daughter, the surname might have been adopted later, and the true male descent might lie in an obscure collateral line, almost forgotten by the wider world. This distance between appearance and descent is one of the reasons why the study of old Scottish families can become so difficult. Galloway's history is full of such entanglements. Old names survived in altered forms. Families vanished and reappeared under different designations. Estates passed sideways through marriage. Literary fame added another layer because once a novelist fixed a certain version of the past in the public mind, correction became much harder. A story beautifully told can outlive a fact patiently proven. That is exactly what happened more than once in the history of Galloway. The district became not only a real landscape of rivers, coasts, towers, and farms, but also a literary landscape in which memory, fiction, and family pride continually overlapped. And yet, that overlap itself says something important about the place. Galloway was not merely a county to be measured in acreage or explained through charters. It had a hold on imagination. Its people, whether old stock or newer arrivals, developed a love for it, strong enough to survive economic decline, social change, and the weakening of older local ways. Writers, historians, families, and ordinary inhabitants all tried to claim a piece of that identity. Sometimes they did so accurately, sometimes not. But the persistence of that effort shows how powerful the idea of Galloway remained. So in the end, what stands out is not only the fine physical type so often remarked upon in the district, nor the old Celtic traits, fading yet still traceable, nor even the literary fame attached to its scenes and stories. What stands out most is continuity beneath change. Galloway changed in ownership, population, and outward custom. New people arrived. Old families faded, languages shifted, agriculture weakened, literary myths rose where facts grew dim. Yet the district kept a strong inner identity, one capable of drawing affection even from those who came late to it. That enduring attachment may be one of the truest things that can be said about Galloway.